I think there's a number of psychological skills coaches should have in preparing for the team. One is good coach-athlete relationships. So working on building the trust, which is hopefully already started. Open communication, both with the athlete, where they're not afraid to come with them if they're hurt or that type of thing, and the coaching staff. The other would be the coach working on their own psychological skills, coming up with a plan for how they want to approach the 6 months leading to the games. How is he or she going to ensure she rejuvenates and gets some rest, spend some time with their family, at the same time really focusing on the intense effort that's needed to be a successful Olympic coach. And the third would be stress management skills. Both for the coach, him or herself, but also to work with the athletes on preparing for stress and to learn how to cope with the unexpected circumstances that are liable to come up. And an excellent way to do that is simulation training, where you let the athletes know, we're going to put you under stress today, we're going to try to distract you, and that's how it's going to be at the Olympics, and there'll be distractions and you need to learn to focus. To help an athlete who's never been to the games be at the games is difficult. First, there's nothing as good as actual experience. However, there's any number of things that can be done. We found sometimes having a discussion with the team, and if you're lucky enough to have some athletes who've been to the Olympic Games with some that haven't, if they just have a discussion, what's it like, what's exciting about it, what's frustrating about it, what surprised you, they can get a lot of exchange of information. It really helps if, and in the last 6 months it might be hard to organize this, but if the athlete's been at the venue of the games, or if somebody's been at the venue or the site, for example, London, and they took pictures of the Olympic venue, if it's volleyball or field hockey or whatever it might be. And then the athlete can see what the village looks like, see what the practice field looks like, see what the stadium that they'll compete in looks like, and then they could do visualization, imagining that. If they thought it was going to be extremely noisy, like they're playing Britain in the opening round of football. We have American coaches do this in American football, but they pump crowd noise into the stadium. So you have to get used to playing in a noisy environment. So many things like that could be done. And I think the last one I would say would just be to tell the athletes there'll be some things that surprise them. And that's okay to be a little panicked for a second, and take a deep breath and you'll get through it. There's a famous quote in America, everybody chokes, but champions deal with it better than the ones who aren't champions. Yeah, if I'm a first-time coach for the Olympics, some of the things that you want to do is, if you have the opportunity, is to talk to some other coaches. Maybe they're in different sports that have been to the Olympics. Ask them what the experience is like. What lessons have they learned from their Olympic experience? Secondly, you need to be focusing on taking care of your team, but realize there'll be some unexpected events and circumstances that come up that you may not know how to handle right away. So having an emergency plan. So if something happens and you're not sure what to do, it's sort of like you take a mini timeout and stop practice or stop something for 10 minutes, or have the assistant coach take the team, and then you handle it. So I think it's very similar to the athletes. The more you can talk to people that have been at the games, the more you can find out about the venue, and then when you go, you're as prepared as you can be. In the time period leading up to the Olympics, whether it's 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, I think athletes want to think a lot about what they can do to rejuvenate when they have a day off. Some of it might be physical. Maybe if you're a cyclist, you're not cycling, but going home and doing nothing may not be the best thing for you. I think you have to know yourself. You may want to go out and have a nice walk in the woods. Sometimes knowing what you enjoy. Remember one power weightlifter I worked with had a toddler, and when he went home, the toddler was 2 or 3 years old, and children at that age don't care if you win or lose. They just want to see you. And that was very relaxing to play with his child, so he'd babysit his child on the day off. Other athletes, I had one athlete watch, this was closer to the Olympics, this was a number of years ago, but the Mel Gibson movie Braveheart, and he'd watch that to relax himself. That was one of his favorite movies. A number of athletes listen to music. I think the athlete needs to determine what's relaxing for them. Ideally, you might try some things out now, and as the games get closer, you figure out what's relaxing for you, and then you do it. Ideally, I'd say 18 months before the game, this would be an excellent time to hire a sports psychology consultant, because then you can build rapport work. We don't always live in an ideal world. London is 6 months away. If you were going to bring somebody in, I'd bring them in really quick. And because you have to try them out to make sure they fit with the team, they have the right personality. They might be very knowledgeable. Secondly, I wouldn't expect too much. Get to know the team, maybe do some simple things. The other is many countries, I'm not sure Poland's situation, but have some psychologists that will be attending to games with credentials for emergency type situations. If you don't normally work with a psychologist and there's 6 months left, you may ask that person that's going to be assigned to the official Olympic Games to come in and meet with your team, introduce themselves, talk about what you're doing, maybe have a chat with them as a coach. So if an emergency situation came up, we had a terrible one in the U.S. in Beijing where a men's volleyball coach was murdered. And that was a crisis situation. It's hard enough to handle that crisis situation under any circumstances, but if you had some contact with the sports psychology staff ahead of time, the athletes know who they are, they can trust them. Because long term, you want to have a long relationship with a sports psychologist, but sports psychologists can also do some emergency work if things come up on the short end. Honestly, that doesn't necessarily always work because it's short notice. It's much like preventative medicine. Preventative medicine keeps us from doing surgery. Surgery is higher risk, but it pays off sometimes. So I'd take that approach. It depends on the question of whether a sports psychologist should go with teams to competitions. I think depends on a lot of factors. The biggest one being the budget of the team and whether they can afford it. If you're working with a sports psychologist in a long-term program, however, I'm not sure most teams could afford to send them to every match or game, but they should go on some. Maybe more for the psychologist than the athlete, because the psychologist gets to see how the team travels. The psychologist gets to see the pre-game preparation, gets the feel of the locker room or the change room, sees how things unfold. So even if your sports psychologist can't travel with a team regularly, it would be great if they could do it once in a while just to see the athletes in a different environment. Ideally, I'm not sure I'd recommend a sports psychologist travel to every competition with a team or an individual athlete. You don't want the athletes to become dependent on the sports psychologist. When I work with an athlete, my ultimate goal is to have them self-regulate themselves and for me to be a support. Yeah, the question about is it more important for a sports psychologist to work with a coach or athlete is very situation dependent. My initial answer would be it's 100% of each. The times I've consulted and I've been able to work with a coach, and working with a coach doesn't mean necessarily I'm sitting there giving coach advice. It means we're having a discussion. and the coach is educating me, and then I educate the coach. It's a partnership. And we're learning about each other, interacting with each other. I may ask questions like, would this example work, to the coach before I bring it up to an athlete. A good example, I worked with alpine downhill skiers. I wasn't a skier. I didn't know if thought stopping in your head, stopping a negative thought, putting a positive one, if that would work at 70 miles an hour going down a slope. I checked that out with a coach before I suggested it to the athlete. On the flip side, sometimes you have a coach that doesn't believe in sports psychology, is maybe very good technically, but psychologically a nightmare for the athlete, but they're the only, what we call, game in town, only coach available in that sport, in that region for the athlete. And then you don't work with the coach, you work with the athlete, and you help the athlete build up armor that takes mesh armor, that lets the good things the coach says come in and keeps the hurtful things out, and how to cope with it. So in summary, I guess I would say, ideally, you're really going to increase your probability of having success with a mental skills sports psych program if you work with both coaches and athletes in partnership. Depending on the situation, sometimes you may just work with the coach, others sometimes with the athlete. If I had to do one over the other, it probably would be the athlete, because if they had a really bad coach who didn't believe it, you still might be able to do some help.